It was Isaac Walton who wrote, "Oh, the gallant fisher's life, it is the best of any. 'Tis full of pleasure, void of strife, and 'tis beloved by many." Hello, this is Nelson Olmsted. There are some people who care nothing for the restful sport of fishing, but I suspect they're very much in the minority. Once a fisherman, always a fisherman, regardless of recurrent disappointment, empty hooks, or stolen bait. Since this sport has retained through the centuries such a passionate following, I've always considered it strange that so few good short stories were ever written on the subject. This situation, however, was recently improved by Cyril Hume, who wrote not only a great fishing tale, but one of the finest short stories I've read in years. Listen while I tell you about the Tarpon. Certain things that happen in life are never to be forgotten. In my case, for instance, it was a special fishing trip in Florida. In 3 days, under the quiet coaching of the young boatman named Thatcher, I took 3 tarpon ranging from 35 to 60 pounds. Thatcher was disappointed that our luck ran no larger, but to me, the sport was so wonderful, I began thinking of myself as an expert. On the 4th day, Thatcher had another fisherman to cast luck with us. When I got to Thatcher's boat that morning, the man was aboard already, seated in one of the canvas chairs, well back under the awning. He had on a fantastically big straw hat that came right down onto his shoulders. Under the brim, I got a glimpse of close-cropped white beard like Supreme Court Justice Hughes' beard, though shorter, if anything. His name was Sanborn, but it didn't appear at first that he wanted to be friendly. As we pulled away from the shore, the old man sighed deeply and snatched the fantastic hat off and sat looking into it. He was so handsome I was startled. The white hair was cropped to the fine skull with healthy pink scalp showing through it. He glanced at me. In his eyes were glints of clear blueness among the crow's feet. And then I saw that he wasn't surly at all, just miserably embarrassed, like a shy child among grown-up strangers. He said, "I'm sorry about this blasted hat. It makes our whole expedition ridiculous." "Why, it's a fine hat," I said. "All kinds of character." "Yes. You see, years ago, I used to be a redhead. My kind of redhead don't ever tan, no matter how you try it. You sunburn, you freckle. Well, I don't freckle anymore, but I still sunburn. I've been to the hospital with it. Some of the same symptoms as with concussion." "Well, you better put it back on then." "Well, the hat won't save me. You'll see before the day's over. I picked the glare off the water. Of course, the hat'll keep me out of the hospital." Well, now we knew about the hat, we all felt better. It even stopped looking fantastic. In another 20 minutes, we reached the fishing place. Thatcher stopped the engine, baited us with bullet, and we began to fish. After a couple of hours, with little to show for the time, I began to think it would be slow. I could see that Thatcher thought so too, but neither of us said anything. Sanborn was still just as expectant as he had been when we started. He kept watching the water where his line went in, his eyes serious and alert among the crow's feet. Thatcher and I both wanted him to catch a tarpon. And when the sun was directly overhead, we decided to have lunch without taking our lines out of the water. We opened the hotel sandwich boxes, and I reached a bottle of beer out of the ice, offering it first to Sanborn. He said, "No thanks. In December, it'll be 42 years since I've had a drink." And Thatcher said, "Well, that's a long time." "Well, I used to drink a great deal. If I told you how much, you'd think I was blowing." "Well, would just one beer start you up again, like?" "I don't know. But I said I'd quit when I was 32 back there, and now I wouldn't want to risk it." He opened a Coke and drank the whole bottle without stopping. I couldn't imagine him with a weakness like drinking, but if he'd been able to stop like that 41 years ago, perhaps it hadn't been a weakness exactly. I wondered what it could have been. Well, after lunch, Thatcher said that he thought of another place we might try, but when we got there, it was the same as the first 2 places. Thatcher wasn't really thinking about fishing anymore. He kept maneuvering the boat to keep Sanborn's back toward the afternoon sun. The fine skin of the old man's nose and cheeks had changed slowly from pink to brick color. Now it was deep crimson. He didn't seem to realize it and kept watching for a strike. Finally, Thatcher said, "That's a mean sunburn you got there, sir." "Yes, it's a glare off the water." "Well, maybe you had enough now, Mr. Sanborn, before you get sick." "Why, we haven't had a strike yet." Well, Thatcher kept maneuvering the boat, and I set myself to distract the old gentleman from the luck we were having. And I said, I suppose you've done all kinds of game fishing in your day. Well, no, as a matter of fact, I've done almost none so far. I had added it in my head. So far was 73 years. I've been busy. When you're busy, you don't often get around to doing what you really want to do. Of course, I've done a little fishing here and there. You know, it's probably a misfortune to get the best thing out of anything the first time you try it. In 1885, when I was 12, my family spent the summer on Lake Spofford, New Hampshire. I got hold of an old flat-bottom skiff and started out to explore. Over by the outlet, I looked down into the shallows and saw the small-mouthed bass guarding their nests on the clean sand, and that did it. I drew my spending allowance for 3 weeks ahead. For my 75 cents, I got what looked to me like the finest fish pole in the local store. It was the biggest, anyway. A single stick of bamboo about 12 feet long and 2 inches through the butt, and I was innocent, light as a feather. The fishing season didn't officially open till the next day, but I could no more wait than if I'd had to go to the bathroom. I dug some worms by the lake shore, found an old scrap of tobacco tin foil for a shiner, baited up, and started trolling. I hadn't sculled 100 yards when I got a strike I really felt in the oars. I dropped the oars overboard, grabbed the pole, and hung on blind. The pole bent over and down, and when it had reached a semicircle, it went all into splinters of dry rot. I think I screamed. And then I saw the line was still holding, and the fish still on it. I dragged in, hand over hand, bamboo slivers and all. And the next thing, the biggest bass you ever heard about was slapping the bottom of my skiff. I was still over him on all fours, watching the last quivers die out of his beautiful gunmetal body, when I happened to look up and noticed a cat-rigged dory standing close in toward me. And then I saw that the fat man at the tiller had a game warden's badge on his vest. He ran up into the wind alongside and took hold of my skiff. When he looked down into the bottom, his eyes stuck out slowly. Finally, he asked me if I'd really took that thing out of Spofford, and I said, yes, sir, and hoped he'd let me keep it in prison. He looked into my face and finally squirted a little tobacco juice in my bare foot, and he asked me what I'd used for bait, and cursed quietly when I told him. And then said that, of course, in China it was already tomorrow as far as fishing went, and he expected I'd been going in Chinese time. And I said, yes, sir, again, not knowing what he was talking about. He cruised around till he picked up my oars for me and finally tacked off, still cursing under his breath. I've had a softness for all New Hampshire men ever since. But I wondered if it mightn't have been better for me if I never caught that fish. Well, why better, I asked. Well, that bass got me off on the wrong foot. From then on, I took it for granted that moments like that were a matter of course in a man's life. I kept looking for the same thing to repeat itself in various forms. I expected ecstasy, you might say. I only felt at home in ecstasy. After that, drinking and so on seemed normal to me. You know, any man who gives himself, mind and body, to the love of women never really gets to know one of them. I gave the whole chase up. Funny, right away I met a woman I really wanted to know intimately. We've raised a family together. That's the thing most people do. And year in, year out, it's the best thing there is to do. I guess it's getting late. And then Thatcher said, well, there's still one more place. It's where this very special old big one hangs out. Nobody's ever hooked him yet, but we got a right to try it. Well, Sanborn brightened right up again like a kid, and I did my best to sound enthusiastic, too. Thatcher started the engine, and we were 3/4 of the way back to the hotel before he stopped and baited up again. It was a broad place with an exceptionally tall mangrove standing at the bend. The water below it was almost black, and the sun was resting on its top branches. As Sanborn cast in, Thatcher winked broadly at me behind his back. He wasn't making fun of the old man. He only wanted me to know that the tide was wrong now, and the story about the big fish was just made up anyway, and he felt as sick about it as I did. And as soon as it was dark enough, we could go home. Now, the mosquitoes were terrible now. After 10 minutes of it, I saw Sanborn's line start to drift off. I was thinking it was those blasted catfish again when I heard Thatcher say, "That's Tarpon!" Sanborn's line paid out faster, and then all at once his reel was screaming. And Thatcher said, "Leave him swallow it. Just touch on the brake so the don't back whip." After about 80 yards, the run slowed down. It stopped, and I saw Thatcher counting to himself. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, hit the devil out of him, Mr. Sanborn. Sanborn's shoulders heaved back on the short rod. Half the line hissed out of the water, straight and stiff, and immediately that fish made that first break, shooting vertically up into the air and seeming to hold himself there with sweeps of his tail and wagging his big head. That was when we all shouted together for the first time, and I think he heard us. During the next hour and a half, he broke probably a dozen times more, far off or right at the boat, but always shooting straight up and out to his full length. And each time he splashed, the birds flew up out of the mangroves and circled in the sunset. And each time we saw him again, we shouted again. It was torn out of us. He was so huge and wonderful in his silver mail, and it was such a fight. I could see the big, fatless old man muscles stand out under Sanborn's shirt like an anatomy chart. His breathing sounded like someone yawning in and out. And finally, Thatcher came up behind his shoulder and asked anxiously if he'd like to be spelled for a couple of minutes. Sanborn's eyes flashed back over his shoulder, crazy blue with excitement. He said, "If you touch this tackle, young man, I'll do my best to kill you." Thatcher stepped back, grinning stiff-lipped through his own excitement. "The old rooster means it, too," he whispered to me. The last break came 10 feet from the boat, and it was as clean as the first one. The sun was setting in red pieces behind the mangroves, and when the tarpon sank back for the last time, he sank back into twilight. And then he lolled over onto his side and died in the twilight while we watched. Thatcher reached over, without even using the gaff, and passed a rope down his mouth and out one of the gills. It was too much fish for us to lift inboard. Sanborn stood looking down at the tarpon as we towed it home. His hands were trembling and his legs unsteady, but his face was calm with a smiling expression. "That's the most fun I've had in years. How old would a fish like that be?" "Well, I don't know, but there were some scientists down here a couple of seasons back trying to study him. A real big one would be maybe 60, 70 years old." "Well, maybe he hatched from the egg in September 16th, 1874. And Sanborn sighed and closed his eyes, settled down in his chair so they'd look more comfortable. I turned my eyes away. When I looked back at him, the sun had set. His whole face was white now, and at first I thought it was only because the sun's redness had gone out of the twilight. And then I spoke sharply. When Sanborn didn't answer, I stepped across. He'd stopped breathing, and when I took his wrist, there was no pulse in it. Thatcher and I looked at each other, and without speaking, decided not to do a lot of excited, useless things. The landing light came into view far up ahead, and we could hear Sanborn's fish wallowing dead in our wake. Thatcher looked back at it again. He said, "That there's a tarpon." You have heard a short story by Cyril Hume entitled The Tarpon. Now, here is Nelson Olmsted with the closing word. I get a tremendous lift out of this Cyril Hume story, almost as if I'd caught the tarpon myself. I hope you've enjoyed hearing it today. This is Nelson Olmsted saying goodbye, and good reading. Nelson Olmsted has presented another great short story from the world of literature. This is NBC, the National Broadcasting Company.